Hello and welcome to the Haaretz podcast. This is Linda Dayan, coming to you from Tel Aviv. In late December, Iran started facing new woes. Economic protests tore through the country, spurred by the devaluation of the nation's currency and the soaring cost of living. Over 10 days, they reached 220 locations in 26 out of the country's 31 provinces. These demonstrations quickly turned political, and the regime was quick to clamp down on dissent. The Associated Press reported that as of Tuesday, at least 35 Iranians have been killed and 1,200 detained amid unrest. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is blaming the demonstrations on foreign interference, claiming without proof that foreign powers like Israel and the United States are instigating them. U.S. President Donald Trump told journalists on Sunday that the United States is watching Iran very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States, he said. This threat is all the more palpable after Iran's longtime ally, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, was arrested by American forces. Israeli officials have welcomed the demonstrations. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Sunday that the Iranians are taking their fate into their own hands, and that he and Israel identify with the struggle of the Iranian people with their aspirations for freedom, liberty, and justice. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett also weighed in, releasing a special message to the Iranian people, telling the, quote, brave men and women rising up across the country, unquote, that the world stands with them. Meanwhile, 3 senior Iranian officials told the New York Times that the regime is in survival mode, with few means to combat their economic hardships, the protests, or the threat of another conflict with Israel and the United States.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Here to talk about the protests, what they mean for Iran, Israel, the region, and the world is Arash Azizi, lecturer at Yale University and author of What Iranians Want, Women, Life, Freedom, and The Shadow Commander, Soleimani, the US, and Iran's Global Ambitions. Arash, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Linda. It's great to be with you.
Let's just jump right into it. Can you tell us a bit about how this current wave of protests started and developed in Iran?
The protests started in late December, and the immediate spark for them was the declining value of the Iranian currency. Iranian currency has been in free fall for a very long time. By late December, there was a point in which a US dollar was trading for 1.5, even 1.6 million riyals. To give you an idea, just a year ago, a year and a half ago or so, it was about 600,000, right? So from 600,000 to 1.5, 1.6 million riyal. Not to mention, 10 years ago, it was 30,000. So it's really, we're talking about a free fall. And the declining value of the Iranian currency just reflects the broader economic challenges, people's falling living standards, having really nothing to look forward to. So that was the spark. Iranians have been in such a quagmire and so clearly opposed to the regime that is ruling over them, so clearly seeing this regime in an impasse, that they've come out in recurrent waves of protests just in the last few years, in 2017, in 2019, in 2020, in 2022, and 2023. So it's more like that some years we don't have protests, but most other years we've had large waves of protests. And that's how they started. And since they've spread, and after 10 days, unfortunately, at least 29 people killed already, they're still ongoing.
Yeah, and like you said, this is definitely not the first Iranian mass protest movement against the government, and definitely not within the last few years. We had the Masa Amini protests, which were ignited by the death of a Kurdish Iranian woman after she was arrested by the morality police. But what makes this current protest different from all the other protests?
I saw someone actually made a sort of a meme online of all the newspaper headlines in previous years that they had said this round is different. But the reality is, there are differences each round. Just you kind of step into the same river twice, right? But there are also similarities. So I would say this round of protests is more similar to 2017, 2019 in that they were ignited by economic issues, in that they're characterized by a lot of protests in smaller cities, which is some of the most brutal killings, for example, happening in Ilam province, in western Iran.
There was the video of the raid at the hospital in Ilam.
Exactly. So Ilam province, this beautiful province in western Iran, sort of half Kurdish, I guess. It's quite a marginal province, right? And you see a lot of these brutalities happen in smaller cities. In 2017, I think in Khuzestan province, also southwestern Iran, you had a lot of similar attacks. So these are the similarities. As for the difference, I'll count up a few differences quickly. First, if some of the previous protests, there's always a mix of hope and anger. And this time, I think, there's a lot more anger because people know that they want an end to this regime, but they don't find an easy path. But, they still come out. There's a lot more despondency. It's sort of desperation. You talk to people, and I've talked to a lot of people who go out, and they basically say, what else would we do? And what do we have to lose? This expression of, what do we have to lose? People use it all the time, but it's really becoming in sort of a true sense for many Iranians. The one other difference is that from the outset this time, some, and not all, or not a majority, of protesters have chanted for Reza Pahlavi, the former crown prince of Iran before 1979, who has emerged as leader of a particular political faction, sort of a right-wing political faction in Iran, or for Iranians. Of course, he lives in the United States in exile. Some people are chanting for him, but at the same time, if in the previous rounds, okay, he was a leader of a particular faction, and there were others who had different factions, this time we are witnessing, unfortunately, a very heavy divide in the opposition. So much so that supporters of Pahlavi are as much against the regime, you could say, as they are against the other opponents of the regime. So, we're living in times of a very heavy divide in the opposition. But last but not least, the most important difference with the previous rounds is all that has happened to the regime since. Yes, the regime was relatively isolated, let's say in 2022 or 2019, right? It faced a lot of sanctions. But in the last few years, it has seen the absolute destruction of its axis of resistance after Israeli attacks. These are Arab militias in the region supported by Iran. And now the so-called axis of unity has also fallen down. But that is Iran's links to Venezuela, the Venezuelan regime, which Khamenei called the closest Iranian ally in 2022. And that regime has gone down now. So, and after the 12-day war with Israel last year, the regime is really more fragile, more despondent in its own way, actually, more besieged, if you will. So it faces the protests in these very different conditions.
And for listeners who might not be as familiar with Iranian political intrigue, who exactly is Reza Pahlavi, and why is he significant here?
So Reza Pahlavi is the last crown prince of Iran before the 1979 revolution, i.e. when Iranians overthrew the monarchy in 1979. He was a young man, then actually seeing training in the US. He was Iran's heir apparent, like a crown prince, equivalent to Prince of Wales for for those who might know the British system better. And in the years since, he was part of the opponents of the Islamic Republic since the early on. He was quite marginal. Even if 10 years ago, the idea that he would be a major political figure would be laughed at. But in the last, I would say, perhaps 5 years, something like that. Yeah, like 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, something like that. In the last decade, he's emerged as a major opposition figure, perhaps the best known opponent of the Islamic Republic abroad, and he tries to sort of organize around himself. Now, there's a dilemma about Mr. Pahlavi. At some point, if you listen to him talking around 2009, 2010, and even later, And then actually at some point during the Mahsa Amini uprising, early 2022, 2023, he sounded like a liberal Democrat. He always sounded like a reasonable Iranian man, right? It sounded like someone you'd like to have a beer with, as they say. So the politics he espoused were generally, centrist, liberal, something like that. But the advisors he picked, and the sort of team he built around himself, and the movement that really coalesced around him is anything but. And I think, I hope you know me by now as a fair person, right? Just I don't malign my political opponents unfairly, I hope, and I sort of describe them objectively. So when I say far right, I mean, we're talking really chauvinistic language, and not just language. I mean, chauvinistic politics, hyper nationalist, ultra nationalist. So to just give you one example, woman life freedom, right, was the beautiful slogan of the 2022 movement in Iran, which really captured the imagination of a lot of us. It came from the Kurdish movement, of course. Woman life freedom sounded exactly the kind of values we were fighting for. It sounded like the exact opposite of the Islamic Republic, right? And the pro-Pahlavi movement now effectively attacks the slogan. They're opposed to it. In fact, even back in the day, they countered woman life freedom with an addition, which was men, homeland, prosperity. It rhymes in Persian. That's fine. And back in the day, it was said as some sort of it was nice, so you just added something to it, right? But now they clearly just hate women life freedom. They attack feminists, and in their own language, like they consider feminism a dirty word. One of the slogans that they repeat is literally deaf to the left, deaf to the left and the mullahs. And they attacked other opponents of the regime all the time. So Narges Mohammadi, Nobel Peace Laureate that I spoke about, this wonderful human rights activist who spent much of her adult life in jail, she was actually attacked physically recently by Pahlavi supporters when she gave a speech in Iran. So this is where Mesa Pahlavi, not only he has not emerged as some sort of a national figure that would be sort of a consensual figure for the Iranian opposition, he's effectively emerged as head of a far-right faction, unfortunately. And he does, as I said, he does have many supporters in Iran, and there are those who support him just by the virtue that they missed the pre-1979 Iran and perhaps not even know about all these details. Some support him as a front runner, basically, right? That they would support anybody who is the front runner against the regime. So they see him in that way, and that's why they support him. But the political reality around him is very concerning for the reasons that I said.
The regime looks at the moment like it's not long for this world, which is something you've also mentioned on social media recently. And this isn't the first time that it's been, quote unquote, on the brink of collapse. What would have to happen now for it to actually go over the edge, do you think?
So this is a very good question. Obviously, as an Iranian, I have wanted this regime to go all my life since I was a kid, right? In fact, if you told a 16-year-old, 17-year-old Arash like 20 years ago that this regime was going to last until 2026, I mean, I would have probably been depressed all my life. So it's like good not to know, I guess, as you're going through it. A lot of words we use around this are a bit like almost innuendo and are not clear what we were talking about. Like when we talk about the collapse, when we talk about the downfall, when we talk about the overthrow, right? What I did say, with some degree of confidence, and I'll say it now again here, is that the Islamic Republic, as we know it, it's not long for this world, as you say. And what do I mean by that? I mean two things. First of all, the basic structures, i.e., this regime as it exists, with the supreme leader who comes out of this really sort of crazy religious system where a cleric is the all-powerful dictator effectively, and everything else with it. And secondly, its core policies, most important. And what are these core policies? Two things again, primarily. First of all, domestic Islamist repression, i.e., an attempt to enforce mandatory hijab on everyone, and everything else that comes with this Puritan Islamist society that is enforced. The only other example, it's like the Taliban's Afghanistan, right? And the second core policy that wouldn't exist is this anti-American, anti-Israeli politics, to the degree that there is. There might be a regime that is also opposed to Israel and America in different ways, but that it won't put all its sort of energy, it wouldn't sort of want to destroy Israel, as it says, and it won't shout death to America every year and try to get into fights and all that. But so I think this will be, these two changes will happen. But how they'll happen, and how we'll get there, there are several different ways. But and the idea of collapse, right? When one thing is clear, I mean, it's not quite likely that you will see sort of a classical revolutionary collapse in my idea. That people come out, they protest, and they protest enough, and at some point they'll go and attack the headquarters of the state broadcaster and take things over, and the regime falls, and a new order comes. I mean, I don't see that happening very easily, and that's because the protesters don't have a leadership, and of course some of them support Mr. Pahlavi, for example, as I mentioned, but they don't have organized networks. They don't have the kind of disciplined political leadership that you need to bring about that kind of change. And the regime on the other side, it's very divided inside, but it has enough cohesion that I think it can escape such kind of collapse. So where does that leave us? Is that I think under domestic and foreign pressure, which I think can be not just pressure. I think it's likely that America and Israel will attack Iran again at some point. I think you'll see some transformations, but the candidates to lead this transformation are much more likely, frankly, at least in the first stage, to come from inside the regime. So in a, longer story short of this is that the next level of developments in Iran will have the color of a coup, perhaps more than even have a color of a revolution, even though there would be a lot of, roles and the pressures put on them by the people and by the protest movements are going to do something to color the situation. But if you're talking about a classic revolution, I don't quite see that happening.
So I want to rewind a little bit to the last time that you and I spoke, which was in June, for an article called "It's Easy to Say End the Regime, but Who Would Replace It?", where we talked about a lot of these same issues. And at the time, we did talk about how there's no real opposition who could take over if the people ousted the Ayatollah. Were there kind of attempts within the last 6 months to kind of rally an opposition together? Because it sounds like the entire concept of an opposition takeover for Iran has been a bit dead on arrival.
Yes, not only there hasn't been attempts to bring more unity, in fact, there's been more disunity, if you will. So what has happened in the last little while is that Mr. Pahlavi has declared himself the transitional leader. The thing about leaders is that if you could just declare yourself something and it would happen, I mean, it would be a different role. But of course, it's not the case. So he's declared himself transitional leader. And, he does have some support in Iran. I want to be very clear about this, right? I hate it when I hear people on the left talk about, oh, his support is only on the diaspora. Look, the guys I played football with when I was a kid in Tehran, some of them are Pahlavi supporters. Every time I'm on TV and say something bad about him, they message me afterwards. This is not a guy whose supporters are only in Florida. In politics, it's very important to not live in your fantasy version of the world, right? He has some supporters in Iran, but they're a minority. And in fact, the rift between them and the rest of people the rest of opponents of the regime has only grown further since then. So no, we don't have any united opposition. And actually, so you have Mr. Pahlavi, who also has some outfits behind him. Let's also be very clear. Mr. Pahlavi has clearly considerable financial support. It's not clear where it comes from. It doesn't come from his supporters because he does not have organized political parties or political organizations. It is clear that there's certainly some support within him for him within right-wing pro-Israeli circles in the U.S. This is just clear as to the places where he speaks, where he's given a platform. The only government in the world in which 2 cabinet ministers support him is Israel. At least 2 cabinet ministers, and I'm being fair and conservative. Like, I'm not even saying Israel as a whole, but there are 2 cabinet ministers, who Gila Gamliel and Amichai Chikli, who repeatedly give support to him publicly. So that's Mr. Pahlavi. But the rest of the opposition has really miserably failed, and that includes me. So I want to be clear about this. What we should have done is to build our own sort of alternative and make it clear that we have a sort of alternative leader and an alternative, if not one person in a group. We haven't done this. Now, the people that I look forward to, if you ask me if there were free elections in Iran next week, who I would want to vote for, these are a lot of protest leaders, civic society figures inside Iran. Folks like Narges Mohammadi, Nobel Peace Laureate, that is currently, God knows where she is. She's in some solitary somewhere. People like Mustafa Tajzadeh, former interior minister, who is also in prison. So that also answers part of this question, right? That the best political figures we can think of are in prison at the moment, unfortunately. The best for me, from my perspective, as sort of alternatives to Mr. Pahlavi. And they're in prison. But, their supporters abroad could have been organized more and all that. So, but we don't really have that. This is why the idea of an opposition takeover as a sort of realistic possibility for the next round of developments in Iran is just not there for me. I don't see it. I'd love to be proven wrong, perhaps, but I don't see it as happening because they, and I should say we, just haven't gotten our act together. And we didn't just have 6 months, by the way. We had the last 20 years, right? So, but it's just not something that has happened.
We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
President Trump initially wrote on his Truth Social platform warning Iran that if it, quote, violently kills peaceful protesters, the United States will come to their rescue. At least 7 people have been killed so far in violence surrounding the demonstrations.
What does the capture of Nicolas Maduro by the Americans in Venezuela mean for Iran? As you said, he's been a major ally, but it also shows just how far the American reach can go.
It's very consequential for Iran. One obvious thing is that Iran just lost its biggest global ally after having lost everything that it did in the axis of resistance after the fall of the Assad regime. This was just another blow. It came at a very terrible time for the regime. When it is facing all these protests, when it's having all these other problems, and when the threats of American-Israeli renewed attacks are there. But it also really was a reminder to the Iranians that Trump is not bluffing, that he could take action against them. And the idea that Trump would, for example, assassinate Khamenei, let's say, with the help of Israel, again, is one of those things that a few years ago, this would have been just unthinkable, something like entirely crazy, right? But now it's really a possibility. And the operation in Caracas just shows that that's the case. It really makes them afraid. Or if you see the reactions to the fall, it really shows many of them have panicked. It also affects internal politics inside the regime. The regime has for long had 2 wings, you could say. One wing sees the salvation of Iran through a compromise with the West. They say, look, we need to come to an agreement with the United States of some sorts. We need to do that. The other wing says, no, actually, we need to rely on Russia and China and Venezuela. So when Saeed Jalili, the hardliner, ran for president in 2024, he'd love to talk about Iran's export of tractors to Venezuela. And, said, this is what we need to do. We need to sell tractors to Venezuela and send watermelons to Russia. And literally that is what he said. This is our salvation. So the other side has egg on its face. Iran would probably lose billions of dollars. According to a top MP, Venezuela owed Iran $2 billion. That, of course, would probably be lost now, right? Not easy to recoup if there's a regime change, in Venezuela, which there is. In this internal battle, also the hardliners have lost it. But there's also one important other point to remember of the effects of Venezuela and Iran. The power in Venezuela, as you know, has not passed to the democratic opposition. Maria Corina Machado was really put down by Trump, who effectively insulted her. If you look at the more in-depth reporting coming out from Venezuela, it appears that the U.S. administration made some calculations, basically, and came to the conclusion that the Venezuelan opposition basically, was not ready to take over the country. I have talked to Venezuelan sort of insiders who are, again, up against the Maduro regime, but seem to agree with this assessment, that there was no way that this Venezuelan opposition had a lot of legitimacy, but it just wasn't ready or able to take over the country, given the military, given the everything else. So this is, of course, sounds like quite a cautionary tale to Pahlavi and to the opponents of the regime in Iran, that even if there is sort of foreign instigation of something in Iran, killing of Khamenei would be the most high order of it. Even in that case, the beneficiary is much more likely to be, again, someone from inside the regime, as is the case in Venezuela, where the power has not passed to Vice President Rodriguez. So I think both opponents and proponents of the regime in Iran are really affected by the news from Venezuela.
Wow. Thank you so much for your thoughtful, comprehensive answers and for giving us some insight into this very difficult to unravel situation.
I wish there was better news to share, but I think that there is some good news. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, which is that this Islamic Republic, which has destroyed Iran for long and been such a bad news for our region, will end in its current iteration. And this makes me hopeful that there will be better days coming.
What a positive note to end on. We don't usually get to do that. Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
And that's it for the Haaretz podcast. I'd like to thank our guest, Arash Azizi, and our producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you enjoyed the podcast and want to continue to listen and support us, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice. And don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz for all the news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world. I'm Linda Dayan, filling in for Alison Kaplan-Sommer. Thank you so much for listening.